Why doesn't Batman kill?
All I've ever wanted to do is kill him.
If your first instinct was to say he's afraid of becoming like the criminals he fights, well, you're right, but there's a little more to it than simply just that. You see, Batman has, over the course of his career, fought several criminals, all with the hope of ending their reigns of terror upon Gotham City. However, ending a criminal's reign of terror doesn't always mean locking them up in Arkham for the rest of their lives. Rather, Batman goes out of his way to rehabilitate his adversaries.
Bruce. Good old Bruce. Always there. You never give up on me.
It might seem strange in our punishing crime-centered society to remember that rehabilitation is a core part of the prison sentence. Batman recognizes many of his villains are deeply unwell people. While he probably can't reform career criminals, like, say, Black Mask, he can help those whose minds are fragmented or are desperate in some way. Batman isn't just an instrument of vengeance, after all. He is an instrument of healing. But is Batman any good at it? Well, that's what this thought experiment is for. See, I wanted to know which superhero was the best at helping their villains seek redemption. I don't think this list will be total. There are many one-off bad guys who show up for a couple issues and then they're fixed that no one ever remembers. I'm not going to mention, for example, the Squid from Spider-Man, a character who maybe showed up twice at most and then got fixed because his dad yelled at him. But I'm going to focus on the heavy hitters, the bigger names. Of the main villains who show up again and again and again, which ones were helped by their heroes? So for this, I'm setting up a few rules. The redemption has to stick, at least for a little while, to count. I'm also rewarding double points, yes, we're getting some double points here, if the character is redeemed in multiple mediums. So for example, the comics, animation, the games, film, etc. As well as if the villain being redeemed is someone else's villain, which happens more than you'd think. So, if one hero can't save him, someone else's can. Something like that, okay? Good. But before we dive too far into today's topic, I want to discuss something important. Now, as many of you guys might know from my various social media posts and posts on the channel, in a little over a month, I will be a new dad. Which means I need to start thinking about a few things. Key of all of those, money. When you're conscious about saving money, you realize you might need a little assistance in managing your finances and all of that boring stuff. And that's where today's sponsor, Rocket Money, comes into play. Rocket Money is a personal finance app that allows you to manage subscriptions, lower bills, and make a custom budget, and grow your savings all in one place. For me, Rocket Money is extremely helpful in setting budgets that help me save money. I mean, I know, shock of all shocks, right? With Rocket Money, you can create a customized budget in seconds. The app shows you where your money is going at all times and identifies top spending categories with insights on how you can stay within your budget better. Rocket Money will notify you about upcoming charges or when your balance is low to help you avoid overdraft and late fees. Rocket Money will also automatically scan your bills to find savings, all for you. With a couple of taps, Rocket Money can negotiate your bills for you, from internet services to cable to phone bills. No need to worry about customer service calls, because I, for one, hate calling customer service. Let the app's negotiators do the work for you, so you can try to get the best possible rate with as minimal calls as possible. To save more money and spend less, join the over 5 million members using Rocket Money today. Scan the QR code on screen right now, or click the link in the description below to get started for free. That's the QR code or the link in the description for free. And now, back to your regularly scheduled antics.
Always beat you out.
The Hulk is an oddball because most of the time, he is the threat. Many of his villains are less evil and more just people who stand in the way of the Hulk's ultimate destruction. Thunderbolt Ross, for example. He's a bad guy, but his motivation is ultimately partially preserving the safety of the world from the Hulk, as well as potentially examining the Hulk and using his powers as a weapon against the world. That's less fun, but, partially. And granted, while Thunderbolt Ross does become Red Hulk, is the Hulk at all responsible for Thunderbolt Ross redeeming himself, becoming a better person, or does that have more to do with Ross's own motivation driving him to heroic efforts once he has the power he's been seeking? Other characters like Doc Samson, they're not really bad guys at all, though they do sometimes stand in opposition to the Hulk. Not really bad guy. And of course, most important of all, the Hulk himself. Does the Hulk redeem himself? There's the Devil Hulk persona, and in the Immortal Hulk storyline, we really get a sense of how deeply fragmented his persona is, as well as how tied it is to the one below all, and the darkest pits of the Marvel Universe. And there are other characters who started as Hulk villains, like Wolverine, who become redeemed by other characters. We'll get to Wolverine later, don't worry. But the thing is, Hulk tends not to resolve his problems through complex psychology or discussion. He tends to solve them with his fists, pounding their heads through the rubble. Now, Abomination, in a very interesting way, in Incredible Hulk Annual 15, is cured of his status of being Abomination, and Emil sets off on the path to become better. This obviously does not last, because, he's still a villain to this day, and of course, Emil did kill Betty Ross, which, not really good for long-term redemption status, though he did ironically save Betty in this, but I digress. Anyway, that's a blip on the Hulk's radar, ultimately speaking, not the strongest count.
Yes! Hey! We know each other! He's a friend from work!
In all of Thor's story, the biggest redemption is, of course, Thor himself, after becoming the irredeemable Thor. But we're not going to talk about that right now. The one that everyone talks about is Loki, across mediums, because Loki is a character who flirts between good and evil constantly. Of course, in the films, Loki's first redemption arc is entirely thanks to Thor and the world around Thor, around the Asgardians, because it spurs him on the path to become better. You could argue that Malekith was just as instrumental for Loki beginning his redemption arc as Thor was, but I digress, at least in the films. That Loki always did skirt the ground between decent-ish character to villain, after all, so his redemption makes sense. But in the comics, Loki starts his path to redemption, starting with the Ragnarok event, where he teams up with Thor to stop Ragnarok. But the real redemption we talk about in the modern day starts in Siege, where he dies in order to turn the tide against Norman Osborn's Dark Avengers, who were invading Asgard. Granted, Loki was also partially responsible for Norman Osborn invading Asgard, but hey, I digress. Baby steps. What happens next is that Loki is reborn as Kid Loki, a new individual who takes great effort to fight his evil nature. I am counting Loki here as a two-pointer because in both mediums, Thor is at least partially accountable for Loki redeeming himself to some degree. I should note that there are many characters like Amora the Enchantress, who don't really count here because, well, the Enchantress just wants Thor. She's not a better person because of her desire, nor does she change herself to become a better person, like certain characters later on, like Catwoman or Black Cat. But rather, she always has selfish intent and always bounces back to villainy afterwards. It's never a redemption, it's more a temporary alliance. We're going to see later on that there are many temporary alliances between heroes and villains that do spur on better behavior from the villains, but this is not one of them. Then there's Scourge the Executioner. Scourge is of course a henchman of Amora, but his arc is a lot more positive. He dies on a mission alongside Thor to stop Ragnarok, in both the comics and in the movies. However, in the movies, Scourge's redemption is completely irrelevant to Thor. It doesn't really have any connection to Thor directly, but rather his experiences alongside Hela. However, in the comics, it's directly in service of Thor, fighting along Thor's ranks. So Thor gets 3 points. Not bad.
Let me go!
Wonder Woman is interesting because she has a ton of stories that are much smaller, where she has diplomatic solutions to problems and resolves one-off conflicts, not through violence, but rather through empathy and emotional discussion. However, since we're not really counting one-and-done characters as successes here, that's not really going to matter. I should note that, of course, in Wonder Woman 1984, she does help redeem Maxwell Lord, something that she does not do in the comics. In both mediums, Wonder Woman does really shift Maxwell Lord's perspective on a few matters. Only one of them's a redemption arc, so point to Wonder Woman there for the films, not the comics. But when going through Wonder Woman's history, the most important redemption arc, I thought, was from the earlier comics, back in the Golden Age and Silver Age, and, well, listen, this is the most controversial one here.
Look, Pym,
I know it's our job to help this guy and everything, but I think this guy's a lost cause. He's obviously made up his mind. Why don't we just cut our losses and get out of here?
Paula von Gunther is one of Diana's earliest villains who gets completely redeemed in the comics. Somehow, despite being, well, yeah. This also happens in Wonder Woman Earth 1 as well, but since those are two comics and not another medium, I'm not counting it as a double pointer. Another character Diana helps redeem is Giganta, though Giganta, it should be noted, switches often, usually in exchange for reduced sentences from prison. Still, she's helped Wonder Woman almost as much as fought her now, and I think it's important enough to kind of say Giganta is sort of on the same track that characters like Deadshot or Harley Quinn are, where she's slowly becoming more of an anti-hero than a villain. That's 3 points right now. And again, that's more debatable, but it's my list and I'm counting her. Finally, the most controversial one I want to talk about is the Cheetah. The Cheetah, throughout most of Wonder Woman's history, all of them have been straight up villains, and very few have stopped being evil, though some have retired in other continuities. However, post-Rebirth, the Cheetah starts off as Diana's friend, and would often switch sides to work alongside or against Diana. Their dynamic has shifted greatly in recent years. If not for the curse that inflicts itself upon Cheetah, she might actually be one of Diana's closest allies in the post-Rebirth continuity. But as it stands, she's her greatest frenemy. Diana's totals up to 4. And by the way, this doesn't count many of the various smaller villains who Diana encounters once or twice, especially in the Gail Simone run. If we counted every smaller character, Wonder Woman might end up being top tier, top 3 at least, of individual heroes. But, you know, we're not. That's the arbitrary rule. It has to be an established character. And unfortunately, Diana has yet to heal people like Dr. Psycho. So, there you go.
That really hurt you! Holy shit.
That being said, though, Ares does switch sides a lot, but I don't count that as a redemption because Ares is still the god of war, no matter how many stories we get through.
Come on! Oh, wait.
Now, She-Hulk is interesting because she's a lawyer. By default, she's representing people who are villains. That does not mean that they are redeemed by She-Hulk, but rather receive fair legal compensation through her. Something similar happens with Daredevil. After all, Daredevil in the comics represents everyone, from Punisher to Venom. So there is some leeway there as well. But She-Hulk has directly helped people outside the courtroom become better people. In terms of villains that she's directly fought, it's hard to overlook the significance of the Punch Club, a club for superpowered adversaries to clobber one another. Naturally, She-Hulk and the ever-loving Blue-Eyed Thing are a part of this group, but so are Titania and Volcana, 2 adversaries first created in Secret Wars, and they're both adversaries of She-Hulk, with the former also being introduced in the MCU She-Hulk show. Also, Absorbing Man joins at one point, and that's interesting because that's someone else's villain who She-Hulk is trying to help redeem. So, bonus points there. I do think of all these characters in the Punch Club, Volcana seems the most well-adjusted, but I'm counting all of them just in case. So that's a total of 4 points, with double points for Absorbing Man being someone else's villain. But I think the most interesting discussion here is with Jack of Hearts. Jack of Hearts was a former Avenger turned into a weapon used against the Avengers by Scarlet Witch during the events of Avengers Disassembled. Jack of Hearts became something of a walking hazard, but She-Hulk and him, through their relationship, managed to work things out. Jack of Hearts, due to his status as an instrument of destruction, does count as an adversary. And because it's my list, and I think it's a cute relationship, I'm counting it. So 5 points for She-Hulk, without counting the various people she's represented over the years, including the TVA. So, I digress.
Are you trying to make us look bad, or is it just a coincidence?
Oh, Johnny didn't mean any harm.
Says the man not covered in soot.
Now, the Fantastic Four are among the more interesting teams in the Marvel Universe to discuss, and it's one of 2 teams I'm collectively talking about, because they work so close together that, you know, if it was Reed or Sue, it's kind of a victory for the whole group. Let's get this out of the way right here. There are 2 big ones, Namor and the Silver Surfer. Now, the Silver Surfer during the iconic Galactus Trilogy event turns the side of good thanks, in part, to Ben Grimm's girlfriend and later spouse, Alicia. In film, that role is either given to Sue or Johnny, but it's still the same essentially, and I think of that as part of the extension of the Four's conflict with the Silver Surfer. As for Namor, well, he gradually becomes less antagonistic towards the surface world, thanks in no small part to his admiration of Sue. And also, Namor himself isn't a full-blown villain, but rather someone who is more confrontational with the surface world. Same thing happens with Mole Man, we'll get to him a little later. Now, interesting enough, during the Mark Waid run of Fantastic Four, Galactus also has something of a redemption arc thanks to the Four. Galactus is reverted to a mortal form, and the Four help Galactus see the world through the eyes of a mortal, which helps give Galactus a new perspective on the worlds he devours, and that's impressive. In general, Galactus has felt some degree of respect for Reed and company, which allows him to approach Earth through a more sympathetic lens. That's as close as you can get to redemption for a cosmic entity from beyond the dawn of time. So, another point to the Four. I do also want to use this as a chance to discuss one of my favorite villain redemption arcs, and that is with the Sandman. Yes, the Spider-Man villain. Sandman joins the Wizards' Frightful Four, a team up against the Fantastic Four from one of their more egotistical antagonists. Now, after a particularly major fight with that lands the Thing in the hospital, who shows up to talk to Ben Grimm and his ward with a six-pack of beer but Flint Marko himself? And I love this scene because it really illustrates how the Sandman, outside of fighting, is really just a career criminal. To him, it's a job, one that stops being personal the moment he leaves. We see a similar mentality with the Rogues from The Flash, which is one of the reasons why I really do like the Sandman and I really do like the Rogues. They're not evil people, they're just, it's a job. It's a job to them. And they don't really hate the person that they're fighting. He's just an obstacle in their way. But Sandman did reform after this conversation, almost immediately so, and he even joined the Avengers temporarily, which is a very surreal thing to say, considering the Sandman, you would never think of him alongside Captain America and Iron Man, but I digress. Of course, it didn't stick, and Sandman did have later redemptions with Spider-Man, but Fantastic Four's redemption is more noticeable and the first. Therefore, the Four get double points for Sandman. Now, it should also be noted that there was also around the same time an event where Sandman and Hydro Man merged together, which probably traumatized Flint a little bit. So, I'll give Spidey a point for that too later. I want to talk about Dr. Doom, who undergoes several changes over the course of his battle against Richards. It's important to note also that Doom is only sometimes truly evil. Outside the Mark Waid run, Doom doesn't really do too many things to make him irredeemably evil. And in fact, he's done many good things for the Four. For example, the birth of Valeria, the second child of Reed and Sue, can either be seen as Doom ensuring Reed never forgets that he is forever in Doom's debt, or a single act of charitable kindness from him towards his mortal enemies. I think Doom really starts to redeem himself more after the Jonathan Hickman Secret War event, in part because of Doom's stint as Iron Man, a role he occupied alongside Riri Williams after Stark was put into a coma by Carol Danvers. However, I genuinely do not know if I can count Doom's swaying morality as a point in the Four's favor, because after all, Doom does shift quite often. He has his own moral code, his own sway of perspectives, and very rarely is he ever a good person. He's always a villain. So I'm not going to give Doom's various attempts at redemption as a point to the Four. But then there's Mole Man, a character who rules the subterranean realm of Subterranea. Now, he launches multiple attacks on the surface world, much like how Namor attacks the surface world from Atlantis. But sometimes he poses as an ally to the heroes, or against another threat. Whether it's forging alliances with Sam Wilson or asking to go out with Squirrel Girl, it's hard to say that Mole Man is a pure evil villain, so much as a nuisance at worst, or a bit of a well-intentioned fighter for his own world. Now, Mole Man has fought villains like Tyrannus, the High Evolutionary, the Collector, but he kind of functions like Dr. Doom or Namor in that he has a moral code, he has objectives, and when the heroes intersect with that moral code, there's going to be problems. So I wasn't even going to consider Mole Man as a point in their favor until I saw the 2025 Fantastic Four film First Steps, where Mole Man is instrumental in helping the Four defeat Galactus. So, I guess I'm reluctantly giving him a point, because the comics Mole Man switches sides constantly. But in the film, he does complete a redemption arc. Superman is a figure who, much like Wonder Woman, will often find solutions to problems that do not require just punching them out. Superman de-escalates and finds peaceful solutions consistently throughout his various stories. So am I going to count, say, Bar-El and Lilo-El from All-Star Superman? Probably not, because again, that's one-off characters. I'm just looking at the big ones. And right away we get two. Bizarro and Mr. Mrs. Picklick. We're just going to call him Mixie because it's easier for me to say.
Superman, I'm Mr. Mxyzptlk, an interdimensional peacekeeper, and I need your help.
Also, I might be mispronouncing Mrs. Picklick wrong, so I digress. Now, those are two major villains who are basically reformed over time by Superman. Now, neither are necessarily evil, especially Mixie, who is more of a mischievous imp than anything else. And Bizarro's just a loner who exists as Superman's polar opposite, without any real sense of right or wrong from himself. But Superman does help him out to some degree, and there is a sense that Bizarro is a good person. He just lacks the capacity to understand that some of his actions are destructive. I mean, hell, he even defends Bizarro World, his own little paradise of his own creation, where everything is inverted. So Bizarro kind of redeemed by Superman, and Superman would, unless he's put into conflict with Bizarro, wouldn't really want to see any harm come to him. Additionally, Superman has helped redeem Livewire and Toyman in the comics. And since Livewire also has a pseudo-redemption arc in My Adventures with Superman, I'm going to count her arc twice. But wait, there's more. There's also the Elite, a group run by Manchester Black, who challenged Superman's no-killing ideology. But while Manchester Black maybe gets worse from there, and many of his group, the Elite, does get worse, there is one member of his team who redeems himself, to an extent. Coldcast joins the Justice League Elite alongside the Flash and Green Arrow. Now that happened after facing Superman, which means Coldcast, another point for the Man of Steel. You're probably asking, does the Flash and Green Arrow also get partial credit for that? Yes, they do. Now, Lex Luthor, though, is where we get complicated, because Lex, like Dr. Doom, will often do good things to ultimately spite Superman. However, I cannot ignore one major story that does, unironically, redeem Luthor to some extent, and that's All-Star Superman. Lex temporarily gains Superman's abilities in the comic, and can, for a brief moment, see the world as Superman does. And his experience absolutely breaks the villain's villainous perspective. He's forced to see that, at the end of the day, Superman sees us not as separate entities like he did, but rather as all part of the same system. That we are all that we have in the vastness of existence. And in fact, the animated version even adds more context to further show that the event really did change Luthor's perspective in the long term. This is kind of unusual, because even though Lex Luthor does kind of become a hero at times, it's usually for selfish motivation. This is an entirely unselfish redemption arc that's been adapted, and this brings up Superman's count to 8. Captain America is a figure who believes strongly in the concept of redemption. And as the leader of the Avengers, he welcomed several villains personally into the ranks of the team. Now, unlike the other team-ups I'm going to include here, I'm counting these primarily as Captain America's will, because Cap was the one person who always vouched for these various characters to join the team, most. And these characters are now so aligned with the Avengers, you might have forgotten that they started as villains. So which characters? Well, Cap led in to the ranks of the Avengers Black Widow, Hawkeye, Quicksilver, Scarlet Witch, and Vision, all of whom started as villains. So that brings Cap's total count right up to 5. But because Quicksilver and Scarlet Witch started as villains in the MCU, I'm counting that as 2 extra points for Cap, bringing his total to 7. And yes, I am considering the fact that both Quicksilver and Scarlet Witch were originally X-Men villains, but, you know, I mean, do I really want to add an extra point for that? Yeah, fuck it. Why not? They were part of the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants. I think Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver becoming heroes is a significant pull for Cap. But we can't stop there, because when talking about Captain America and redemption arcs, you always come back to Bucky Barnes, the Winter Soldier. Now granted, Bucky didn't start out as a villain, but rather was brainwashed and turned into an assassin following his apparent death in World War II. But he had to be brought to the forces of light. And who was the one who forced that to happen? Cap. In every continuity, there are two things that are consistent. One, there is always a Winter Soldier who always ends up fighting for some terrorist organization. And two, Steve Rogers will always bring him to the side of justice. Every time, different ways, but the same end result. And it's important to note these are reoccurring throughout the various adaptations of Captain America. These are instrumental parts of his character. These are stories that are constantly retold. Now granted, Cap has never even tried redeeming his greatest villains, like say the Red Skull or the forces of Hydra.
Look, Pim, I know it's our job to help this guy and everything, but I think this guy's a lost cause.
Though things do get tricky with Helmut Zemo. Zemo is the creator of the Thunderbolts, the original creator in the comics, and has throughout his history switched sides between heroism and villainy. He even helped aid Captain America multiple times, including during the events of Civil War. In the comics, at least. In the films, Zemo has a very different role in Civil War. He also helped save the universe from Genis Val, who Zemo learned was going to cause the end of reality in some possible future. However, I don't credit Cap with Zemo's redemption, because a lot of these happened because Zemo was just part of the Thunderbolts. On this path he set for himself to become better. So Cap doesn't really have any real influence on Zemo in those instances. So I won't count those as points, but the fact that Cap has so many iconic stories about redemption is so ingrained in his story that they're adapted consistently throughout film and throughout animation and throughout all these different versions of Cap, I think that's worth discussion.
I know what it's like to try and rebuild a life. I had a bad day too, once.
The Caped Crusader himself. You might be surprised he's not higher on the list, but bear with me on here. There's a lot that Batman does that is incredibly important. There's always the stereotype that Batman runs around and just beats up mentally ill people in the streets, but I think you seriously underestimate how much good Batman has done for the criminals of Gotham over the years. Not just in terms of stopping crime from happening, but in genuinely wanting to see them become better people. Let's start with the most obvious cases first. Catwoman and Harley Quinn, two of the most notable redemption arcs in comics. Some people even forget Catwoman was ever a villain to begin with, because of how effective that redemption arc was. And while I should note that Harley in the films redeems herself thanks to her relationship with Task Force X, the DCAU, where she first appears, has Batman constantly trying to help redeem Harley to bring her to the side of light, and at times helps push her down the path to recovery. So that's going to count here. And in the comics, we're going to get to the Gotham City Sirens in a bit, but Batman does support Catwoman's efforts with the Gotham City Sirens, so I do see that as part of an extension of Batman's world. We'll get to that in a second. Penguin and Riddler are both also reformed. Penguin tries to distance himself from his criminal enterprise to become a legitimate businessman, and that lasts for quite a while. As for Riddler, after figuring out Batman's identity, he gets bored with crime and becomes a private investigator. Both I credit to Batman. Granted, both became criminals afterwards again, but I digress. Now, what's also interesting about Batman is he doesn't just redeem the criminals who already exist, but he also helps prevent the next generation of criminals from being created. And nowhere is that more obvious than the various children of villains he's brought into his Bat family. Cassandra Cain is the daughter of Lady Shiva and David Cain, two of the most deadly assassins in the DC universe. Stephanie Brown is the daughter of the Clue Master, a dangerous criminal similar to the Riddler. And Damian Wayne, aside from being Bruce Wayne's own son, is also the son of Talia al Ghul, daughter of Ra's al Ghul. Now, none of these are true villain redemptions, though you can argue Damian was a little, had some villainous tendencies in him beforehand, but it does prove that Batman wants to help prevent those who are raised in criminal families from becoming criminals themselves, offering them the right attention and care they needed. And so, I'm counting it, that's bringing Batman's count up to 7. Of course, there's another member of the Bat family that we're ignoring, and that's Clayface. Yeah, Clayface. He redeems himself in Detective Comics post-Rebirth, where he joins the Bat family for a time, and arguably one of the best post-Rebirth comics to come out, in my opinion anyway. Now, what's fascinating about Clayface's redemption is it sticks. It genuinely does stick to the modern day in comics. Now, Clayface is tortured and loses control of himself, and Batwoman has to kill him. She's forced to kill him, and she seemingly does. But Clayface does recover from that near-death experience and doesn't go back to villainy afterwards, but rather creates opportunities for other Batman villains to redeem themselves, including Killer Croc, Firefly, and even Poison Ivy. So Batman helping Clayface redeem himself pays it forward to the rest of Gotham, and that's a point in Batman's favor, pushing him now to 8. I have to reiterate, the Gotham City Sirens that Catwoman assembles with Harley Quinn and Poison Ivy, that's another case of Batman's actions paying it forward. Through Catwoman, Batman's influence allows other villains to find some degree of redemption. But of course, I'm ignoring a big one, Jason Todd.
This is the best day of my life.
Jason Todd starts as a car thief, trying to jack the wheels off the Batmobile, and Batman takes him in to raise him to be a better man. And after he's killed by the Joker, he comes back much later, again, shenanigans, as the Red Hood, a Punisher-esque character who slays criminals rather than trying to mediate kind results with them. And Batman helps him out too. And outside of stories like Hush 2, which misunderstand Jason Todd's role in the story, Jason Todd is stuck more or less on the side of justice, despite some fights and battles with his fellow Bat family members on occasion. I also want to discuss another villain who is kind of passed around the DC universe, but I didn't really get a chance to really discuss elsewhere, and that's Solomon Grundy. Solomon Grundy is a zombie who comes back multiple times with different personalities. As a result, these different personalities will sometimes be more destructive, more villainous, or more gentle, more kind, more generous. Because of this, it's hard to credit any one hero in DC with Solomon Grundy's redemption, because there's a lot of factors into play and it's not consistent. So I want to give him kind of a general point to the whole DC catalog of heroes, though I'm not going to really count it for anyone in this lineup for that reason. I do want to point out, though, a case that stood out to me, which is The Long Halloween, where Batman treats Grundy with dignity and respect. Though the DC animated universe, I think, does the Grundy redemption a little better, this one instance stands out to me as a comic reader, even years later. Now, two characters I want to talk about that I kind of alluded to, at least with one of them, is Poison Ivy and Two-Face. Poison Ivy, I mentioned with the Gotham City Sirens, is brought a little closer to the light. Poison Ivy is never as clear-cut of redemption as, say, these other characters, because she does flip-flop a lot in the comics. Two-Face, however, also flip-flops, and it's a little trickier. Two-Face does get plastic surgery to heal himself. He does go through therapy to kind of pull himself out of this horrible funk he's in, thanks in no small part to Bruce Wayne, his good friend's influence. Across mediums, we see this happen. Two-Face struggling with his split identity to become a better person. And unfortunately, very often, he struggles, he fails, he stumbles, because his split persona is just too difficult for him to overcome. And that's something really good about Batman. Even when a character like Two-Face completely slips into mania, after pulling himself out of it, Batman is always there to help them back up again. And that's something really great about Batman as a character that I feel a lot of adaptations of Batman miss. Except the DC animated universe, which does feature Two-Face in multiple scenes, pulling himself out of the crux of his own psyche. Now, even though not all these redemptions stick, Bruce is there at some point in their healing. And so I think it's important to give a couple extra points to Bruce for that, bring his total up to 12.
Dude, as soon as you finish your drink, turn yourself in.
Got me again, Flash.
Now, the Flash is honestly one of those heroes who has such a complicated history with so many different iterations. Barry Allen, Wally West, there's so many of them. So with all of that, I'm going to focus mostly on Barry, though Wally and the rest of the speedsters are going to have a role in this discussion. Now, the thing with the Flash's villains is that there's a range of them. Now, some are lovable rogues and goofballs. Even though they're dangerous, they're not evil. And then there's others who are the embodiments of petty cruelty and death itself.
It was me, Barry.
I think this guy's a lost cause.
For example, every speedster is being chased in the Speed Force by death. So yeah, there's a big range. And so as a result, some bad guys are irredeemable. Others are easily redeemable. Trickster and Pied Piper are two Flash villains who I think are the most memorable reformations. Now, Pied Piper was never really super evil, and Trickster pulled a reform after making a deal with the devil and figuring, well, I don't want to go to hell, so I guess I shouldn't be pure evil anymore. Which, you know, that's a motivation. Now, Trickster, I should note, is currently a villain again in the comics, but he's also with the Rogues. We'll get to the Rogues a little later. Now, again, with Trickster, there's a very memorable scene in Justice League Unlimited where the Trickster appears and, well, he's obviously not really all that villainous.
James, you're off your meds, aren't you?
I'm better off without him. Take him if I start feeling down.
And Flash, rather than punish the Trickster, tries to get him some medical help to help him out, which is great. I love that. It's such a nice little touch that really shows how differently Flash treats his antagonists. Then there's Captain Cold, one of the most iconic Flash villains of all time. Following Forever Evil, he redeems himself. He becomes a hero. Granted, it doesn't stick permanently, but it is substantial. And then there's in the Arrowverse where Captain Cold's basically an anti-hero pretty early on. He's a criminal with honor at worst, and a gruff hero at best. So I'm going to count that also as another point for the Flash. But we can't go on without discussing the Rogues. All of them. The Rogues are a collection of the Flash's various villains. They all follow Captain Cold's straightforward honor. No unnecessary killing, just do the job as assigned, etc. And often they will team up with the Flash. When one of the Rogues breaks the terms of conduct, like the second Captain Boomerang does, they're kicked out and basically blacklisted from the Rogues. Now granted, some of the Rogues' rules are out of practicality. For example, killing innocent people will draw the speedsters faster, and they recognize the Flash as a threat who, if he ever got serious, could wipe the floor with all of them. And the Flash sees them as legitimate threats. Because they take themselves so seriously and are so calculated, they do have what it takes to put the Flash down. However, they also work with the Flash on multiple occasions, because while they may be career criminals, they have morals. They aren't evil. They do have things that they want to protect, and they will align themselves with the Flash if needed. So in this sense, they're not really pure evil. And that's interesting. That's dynamic. That's clever. I like that. Of course, with the Rogues, there's so many members and so much there, and they aren't really permanently redeemed. So I'm going to kind of take a middle ground and just award them a general 6 points for that. Because across the various mediums and across the various adaptations, the Rogues are partially redeemed, and it's partially due to the Flash. Now that's not even getting to Captain Boomerang, whose redemption is a whole thing with Task Force X and all that, so I'm just going to give like a general 6 points. But finally, I do want to discuss one more Flash villain who is redeemed. I'd be ignorant to mention it. Wally West. Yeah, the Flash himself is redeemed by the Flash. Kinda. Specifically Wally West following the events of Hero in Crisis, where he basically ends up killing a lot of people in this complicated, convoluted plot. No one really likes Heroes in Crisis, and the plot itself is very tragic, but Wally took accountability for his actions. Arguably, he really shouldn't have, not all of them were his own fault, but that's a whole discussion for another day. When he turns himself in, it sets himself down a series of events. He ends up healing himself and his own pain through interaction with the Speed Force, through the legacy of the Flash itself. And because it's such an interesting arc, I am going to count it as part of this collection of redemptions. But as you're going to see really quickly, even if you disagree with my methods right now, with counting all the Rogues and all that, it really doesn't matter. The specific points with the next two really don't matter at all. The counter is about to break with these next two.
Peter Parker. Brilliant but lazy.
We've gotten to Spider-Man now, one of the most iconic heroes of all time. And the list of criminals he's redeemed is ridiculous.
Now, all we gotta do is lure these guys someplace, right? Try to cure them while they try to kill us, and then send them home.
I mean, granted, he's the friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. Most of Spidey's villains are either put upon criminals or scientists who get caught up in terrible experiments. These aren't really evil people at the core of it. And again, we're not counting guys like the Squid or Big Wheel. We're counting the big names, right? If we counted the small names, we'd be here for an entire hour. Let's start with the two big ones, Black Cat and Venom. I mean, hell, Venom started as one of the villains for Spider-Man. Though a lot of fans today might forget that Black Cat wasn't always a hero. That she started as a cat burglar, a villain who fought Spidey, before the two developed some form of attraction. In fact, it's because of that attraction that Black Cat became a better woman. She became better for Spidey. This is unlike Amora, who just acts better. No, Black Cat genuinely became a better person. And while she does relapse occasionally into crime, her arc is very interesting to watch because she genuinely changes. On the other hand, Venom's redemption is also very interesting. Venom starts off as overwhelmed by his hatred for Spider-Man. And while there is a conversation between himself and Wolverine in a retcon that kind of shows the beginnings of Venom's redemption, he really makes a change during one of his biggest fights with Spidey, where the two of them have to work together after a big fight to save Anne Weying, Eddie Brock's ex-wife. This leads to a very simple truce. Spidey doesn't go after Venom, Venom won't go after Spidey. That gives Venom an opportunity to become a hero in San Francisco, which leads him to becoming a better person. And while they do get pitted against each other time and time again, there's undeniably a different dynamic here. Venom's rivalry with Spider-Man softens. They become personally involved in the other's lives in ways that help show that they do have a care for those outside of their petty rivalry. And this gets even more extreme after Eddie loses the symbiote and becomes at the mercy of his own cancer. And it's only thanks to Aunt May that Eddie doesn't die alone. And when he comes back, as Anti-Venom first, he becomes a hero, saving Spidey from Norman Osborn and Scorpion, who now has the Venom symbiote, as well as later the Spider Island event. And then much later on, Venom becomes an outright hero with the Avengers fighting against Null. Venom go through a complete arc. It's not just thanks to Spidey, it's thanks to Aunt May, it's thanks to Mary Jane to a lesser extent, it's thanks to a lot of factors at play. But that does not change the fact that because of Spidey, Venom becomes a hero. But we're only getting started. Oh, and by the way, all these arcs I just mentioned, they're also reflected in the 90s anime cartoon, so double points right there. Spidey has 4 points to begin with. We're just gonna keep going from here. The Prowler, Cloak and Dagger, Kane, all of whom started as very sympathetic antagonists before shifting into heroism. Now, when I say the Prowler, I don't mean Miles Morales' Prowler, I mean Hobby Brown, who you probably know better as Spider-Punk from Across the Spider-Verse, which, I mean, that kind of shows that Miles Morales is surrounded by Prowlers of all different kinds, but I digress. Hell, he even is a Prowler, one alternate continuity in that movie. It's amazing how tied Miles Morales is in the public to the Prowler, even though the Prowler started as one of Peter Parker's friends. Now, Cloak and Dagger is interesting because they're often introduced in other adaptations as outright heroes, but they started as very sympathetic Spider-Man antagonists. And that's changed substantially. Kane also appeared not as a villain in Ultimate Spider-Man, so that only counts as one. But then again, Kane's whole arc is fascinating, starting as a clone of Peter Parker that was a failure, a deformed, monstrous clone who fights Peter and Ben Reilly at first, before gradually becoming a hero in his own right as the Scarlet Spider. The Kane Scarlet Spider run is deeply underrated, I think, and I think it's a shame that the only thing people know him now as is as a PlayStation 4 exclusive skin from Marvel Rivals. Kane's a great character. Anyway, what are we at? 7? It's not going to matter soon. You'll see why quickly. We're only getting started. Cardiac, another villain. He's redeemed. Although, again, he's more fighting the medical system, which is corrupt, so it's very easy to be sympathetic towards a guy who's fighting evil medical people. I digress. The Lizard, another guy. Lizard, he's helped out multiple times. Peter Parker constantly helps the Lizard overcome his animalistic nature. Hell, even after the Lizard eats his whole family, Peter Parker still helps redeem the guy. In part thanks to Ben Reilly's cloning technology, which helps undo all the damage of the Lizard eating his entire family. It's a whole thing. That's in animation and in live action, so counting the Lizard is double. But wait, there's more. Tombstone and Spidey have worked together multiple times in the comics for the greater good. Now, there's one occasion recently where there was a whole big war for who's going to be charged in the criminal underworld of New York City, and Tombstone's daughter was going to get involved. And so Tombstone got involved in the war to keep his daughter from becoming a criminal, to kind of keep her from soiling her hands with the same blood he had drenched his hands in previously. And there's a part where Tombstone almost kills his daughter, and Spider-Man has to stop him. But in doing so, Spidey ends up falling in front of an oncoming train, and he ends up saving both Tombstone's daughter and Tombstone from death. And Tombstone can just kill Spider-Man. He has the chance, but chooses not to, instead saving Spider-Man's life by getting him medical treatment. And that's pretty substantial. That's a big deal for Tombstone. Rhino, another odd example, since he flip-flops a lot. But he's more of a Miles Morales villain now than the Peter Parker villain. The Miles Morales comics are really interesting. But there were a few occasions where Peter did help Rhino find some degree of redemption. But undeniably, one of the most important ones, Harry Osborn. Harry Osborn is Peter's good friend who is ultimately driven to mania, partially by drug addiction, but also by his father's legacy, his father's abuse, and his father's Green Goblin formula. Throughout the decades, Harry and Peter fight and clash. Harry produces some of the worst things that have ever happened to Peter, but across adaptations and the comics, the fight ends the same way. Harry and Peter find common ground, and Harry sacrifices himself to either save mutual loved ones or Peter himself from certain death. This is true in the comics, the cartoons, and the Raimi films. So, more points for Spider-Man. Though I should note that in the 90s cartoon, Harry doesn't die, he gets to live a happy life after giving up being the Green Goblin. So that's the most optimistic ending for him. Also, we're not counting The Amazing Spider-Man 2, those movies ended prematurely. Who knows where Harry's arc could have gone if there was just one more film there. Now, at this point, we've already broken the Flash's limits that we set, but let's just keep going. Again, points don't matter. Who else is there? Doc Ock. During the Superior Spider-Man line, Doc Ock takes over Peter Parker's body, and as a result is confronted with the good that Peter does, with the responsibilities of being a hero. He acknowledges that Peter is a better hero than he can ever be, and redeems himself at the end by allowing Peter Parker to return to life. And in fact, as the superior Spider-Man in an alternate reality, helps lead the charge against the Inheritors during the Spider-Verse arc. And again, Doc Ock's redemption is reflected in the films as well. So again, another point for Spider-Man's favor, and another bonus point accordingly. And hell, while we're at it right now, let's add a few more villains to the count. Sandman, Electro, Vulture, all from the various Spider-Man films. They all get redeemed in the films. Maybe not in the comics, but in the films, certainly. So there you go right there. Sandman might not have been redeemed by Spidey in the comics. Even then, partially he was actually. Because Peter Parker did help redeem Sandman much later on after Venom took a bite out of him and Sandman was losing control of his body. Also, you can also credit part of Sandman's ultimate redemption to the time Sandman and Hydro Man fused together. Oh, and by the way, let's take a look at a big one right now. Norman Osborn himself. Yeah, in the comics he gets shot with a redemption bullet, basically, and becomes a good guy. It's ridiculous and dumb, but he's a good guy now in the comics, apparently. But what's even more fascinating is that Norman in the films is also redeemed when they remove the Goblin formula from his body, eradicating the source of his mania in No Way Home. So there we go. In both comics and films, even Norman Osborn gets a redemption arc. I mean, hell, aside from maybe like Carnage, there are very few Spidey villains who don't at some point get redeemed. And that's not even counting the more obscure characters like Demo Goblin. I was going to go do a whole thing about Demo Goblin, but then I figured, why bother? Spidey's already won the list of individual heroes. Because you see, the problem is when I first started this project, I knew right away who the winner was. The gap between Spider-Man and number one is so massive that there's no point even beginning to calculate it.
Why do you ask questions to which you already know the answers?
Spidey might win the individual award, but the X-Men win overall, because almost every single mutant is redeemed. Except for Sinister, who's just an asshole. But aside from Nathaniel Essex, every mutant has at least briefly been redeemed thanks to the X-Men, and that's entirely thanks to the Krakoa arc, where all the mutants are brought into the island of Krakoa as a new nation, aligning themselves with the interests of helping mutants out. Villains who would fight each other all the time are now neighbors in a total paradise that established itself as something truly distinct in the Marvel universe. Krakoa breaks the entire list. But again, even before Krakoa, there were a ton of redemptions. I'm going to briefly go over this because I don't want to beleaguer the point all that much. Magneto, obviously. He leads the X-Men multiple times. He's had multiple redemption arcs. Magneto counts. And that happens in the film. That happens in almost every adaptation. But then there's the Juggernaut, Rogue, Emma Frost, Deadpool. Hell, Wolverine started as a Hulk villain. Mainstays in the X-Men, who have been part of the team for decades, all started as villains. Actually, for that matter, Rogue started off as a Carol Danvers villain, as did Mystique for that matter, and yet both of them, at some point or another, aligned with the X-Men's intentions. Then there's Sunfire, the mutant who joined the all-new X-Men alongside Wolverine and Storm. He started as an antagonist. Even Ensaba Nur himself, Apocalypse, the first mutant, one of the most dangerous figures of all time, underwent a redemption arc with the X-Men, as did freaking Sabretooth. I didn't mention the Axis event until now, because really Axis is its own kind of self-contained thing where several villains had their morality inverted. I mean, Carnage became a good guy in this arc, but it's all because of mind control. No one actually changed them on a fundamental level, except for Sabretooth, who afterwards joined the X-Men. And that's not even counting the Dark Phoenix arc. The Phoenix, or the Shi'ar, who are antagonists, or the Morlocks, who are antagonists, or the various members of the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants, who are antagonists. They all get redeemed or have lessened their evil at some point or another. The only characters who never get redeemed by the X-Men are the human villains, for the most part, or the Sentinels themselves. Nimrod or Bastion, they're never getting redeemed at all. Neither would someone like Stryker. But the various mutants, they do. And those characters number in the hundreds. In this list, we're not putting hundreds of characters against the rest. It's just unfair. We're not counting every individual mutant redeemed. It's just unfair at that point. So Spidey and the X-Men are ultimately the top tier characters. And it's interesting too, I think, how Spidey and the X-Men have some of those memorable, beloved villains in comics. But they're also written in a way that's human and compelling. We sympathize with them. We relate to them. We understand them to some degree. And so writers over time want to write them in ways where they get to have their happier endings.
Well, it's good to see you, dear boy.
It's good to see you.
I think that's why these characters, these rogues galleries, are so beloved by fans. Because the humanity there implies that even though they are a threat to the hero, they're also hurting themselves with their own actions. And as a result, we want to see them recover from that. We want to see them do better, be better. And because our heroes are so compassionate, they're able to see things through the eyes of their villains. And meanwhile, other characters like Superman, like Wonder Woman, they might be driven by being compassionate and compelling, but there's something way more human about how Spider-Man and X-Men redeem their characters. Not that Superman and Wonder Woman aren't human. They're great characters, don't get me wrong. But there's something so relatable about the down in their luck everyday person, or the oppressed minority, finding compassion in their heart for someone else. I think it's really clever how they write them like that, because it helps lead to why, I think, the X-Men and Spider-Man are among the most beloved superheroes ever. The humanity, the compassion, the fact it's relatable, both in terms of the hero themselves and who they fight. Because after all, if even a monster can be redeemed, that means there's a chance for the rest of us as well.
Look, Pim, I know it's our job to help this guy and everything, but I think this guy's a lost cause. He's obviously made up his mind. Why don't we just cut our losses and get out of here?